I want to welcome everyone here today. I'm David Weinstein. I'm the director of the Center on Japanese Economy and Business, also known as CJEB, for those of you in the know, and the Carl S. Shoup Professor of the Japanese Economy at Columbia University. And I'm delighted to see so many young people and older interested in today's topic, the challenges facing young people in Japan. Before turning it over to our speaker, I want to just introduce the center briefly. We were founded in 1986, and we aim to promote understanding of Japan's economy and its business systems in an international context. CJEB is the only research center focused on the Japanese economy within a university setting in North America, which makes us very special. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Randall Jones. Randy was, some of you may know, he's spoken here a number of times, and we obviously have not been getting big enough rooms for him. There's around 20 people in an overflow room, so I apologize. Just imagine at least 20 more people in the room than are here. Randy is a research associate at CJEB and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University SAIS and former senior counselor for East Asia and head of the Japan-Korea desk at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Few people can have claimed to have written the book on Japan and Korea, but Randy has written the book many times. He was in charge of actually putting the OECD reports on these countries together. And these are, if you haven't looked at one of these reports, they are just an invaluable source of information on what is happening in Japan and Korea. He was a visiting scholar here at Columbia from 2019 to 2020. And I'm just delighted to have him here. Any of you who have taken my undergraduate class know I use his book in that class. It's just a wonderful source of material for anyone interested in the topic in Japan. Just for the sake of time, I just want to say just a few words about Randy's illustrious career. In addition to the roughly 16 economic surveys of Japan and Korea that he has written, he also spent 3 years serving at the Council of Economic Advisors and as an advisor to the State Department in 1989, or starting in 1989. He also was awarded one of the most prestigious medals by the Japanese government, the Decoration of the Order of the Rising Sun from the government of Japan in 2016, and forgive my pronunciation, the Sungye Medal of the Order of Diplomatic Service Merit from the government of Korea in 2018. Before I just pass the floor over to Randy, I just want to also thank our corporate and individual sponsors for their generous support. They're listed in the booklet that you have received. We get no financing from the business school or any other source at Columbia, so these gifts are essential for us to produce events like this. So after Randy finishes, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So please think about questions that you have. And the other thing I want to just remind everyone is please silence your cell phones so we don't have phones going off in the middle of the day. So without any further ado, Randy, the floor is yours.
I'm delighted to be back at Columbia. I'm very happy to be back at Columbia and to see friends, David and Ryoko, and Sarah as well. And it's always a pleasure to be here. I have lots of data because at OECD, one of the purposes of OECD actually is collecting lots of data. So this will all be on the website soon. So don't feel like you have to copy everything down. I'll just go through these slides and you can look at it later if points are interesting to you. I want to speak today about the challenges facing young people. As someone who lived in Japan, and I made 80 trips there over the years and lots of research. I'm always surprised what an amazing country Japan is, all the quality of life, all the attributes. At the same time, I sense a certain pessimism among young people. And the government's white paper on children's policy, this year actually, said that only 23% of young people believe that Japan has, quote, a bright future. So there seems to be a certain sense of unease about the future. The economic uncertainties and financial insecurity of young people, and also where the per capita income has been falling relative to other countries, might be one of the reasons for this lack of confidence. And the financial insecurity stems in part from low wages for young people, given the seniority-based wage system, and the prevalence of low-paid non-regular employment, especially for women. The lack of financial security for young people undermines family creation and leads to Japan's very low fertility rate, and that's become really one of the top government priorities. Prime Minister Kishida made that kind of a slogan, trying to create a new society based on children and families. And at the same time, the demographic transition, the number of elderly is rising rapidly. The ratio of elderly to young is rising rapidly. That further creates burdens on young people in Japan. And then the upward pressure on spending for these older people is also creating problems for the fiscal situation. Japan starts with a high level of government debt to GDP. So just to put this in a diagram, I'm going to talk about the labor market issues, which in turn contribute to financial insecurity among youth, prompting them to delay or abandon the idea of marriage, making a couple, leading to fewer children, a falling fertility rate, a shrinking and aging population, and that in turn increases the burden on young people, and it creates problems for the government in fiscal terms. So I'll briefly talk about, starting with the pessimism problem, labor market practices, and the financial insecurity among young people, the elderly population, and the spending challenge. But first of all, the OECD, one of the things they measures is performance of 15-year-olds. We call it the PISA study, and it ranks countries in their performance in terms of science, math, and reading in their native language. And Korea and Japan have always been at the very top, sometimes with Finland. But we also ask the 15-year-olds, are you happy? And I don't know if that's a very subjective question, but in this survey, Japan comes across with the bar being those reporting high life satisfaction. Japan is the second lowest after Korea. And the triangle is the adolescents reporting low satisfaction, and there Japan is the third highest. One reason that 15-year-olds might be not so happy is the education system. So this asks the parents of these students, what do you think about the school system? And only 60% are satisfied, which is relatively low compared to other OECD countries. Part of the dissatisfaction with education might be the juku question. I know my Japanese friends are always faced with the dilemma of how to afford juku if they have a number of children, and it creates more pressure on the children. China, for example, has a large after-school tutoring program, industry basically, and they've canceled or outlawed the Chinese version of juku. And we'll see if that works. Korea tried the same thing about 25 years ago. They made their hagwon in Korean. They made those illegal, but the whole thing just went underground. And so parents would pay people to come to their house, saying this is a cousin coming to visit their cousin. So basically, they couldn't kill it. And finally, the Supreme Court said parents have the right to force their kids to go to juku or hagwon in Korea. I think the juku and education system contributes to the large share of young people in Japan who say that their life is too stressful. Japan is this is developing countries as well as high income. So Japan is the third highest proportion, followed by Korea and China, the other countries that have a very pressurized education system. And looking at the trends in per capita income, Japan was almost 90% of U.S. per capita income on the blue line when the bubble, just before it collapsed. And then since the collapse of the bubble in the last decade, we've seen a downward trend over time. So today, per capita income in Japan is only 2/3 that of the U.S. If we compare Japan to the OECD average, the red line, Japan was 20% above, and now it's slightly below. So there's a feeling that Japan's economy is falling relative to other high-income countries. And so that might explain why the share of Japanese youth who expect their income to exceed that of their parents is rather low. Only about 16% think that they will have more income than their parents. So let's turn to the labor market. Prime Minister Kishida, when he was in office, talked about raising the income for young people. He talked about creating a job-based pay system, which basically means not so much based on seniority, and second, allowing non-regular workers to transform or move into regular status. So the seniority-based wage system is one of the things that Japan's famous for. If you look by firm size, people in their 50s make almost twice as much as people starting their career, 20 to 24. So the impact of seniority is strongest for large companies and for male employees, and also for people with higher education. If we look at a cross-country comparison, how much does seniority boost wages? Japan ranks relatively high. The impact of seniority going from 10 to 20 years leads to a relatively large increase in your wage. Turning to the question of female employment, in terms of quantity, we've seen a big change. When I was in graduate school, people always said Japanese women aren't employed. They don't join the labor force. Given the labor shortages, we have many women have joined the labor force. So the female employment rate is now about 71%, slightly above the OECD average. And if we look at the gap between the male employment rate and the female rate, it's down to 11 points. So it's about the average of OECD countries. The real question is the quality of employment. And that goes into the question of labor market dualism. So this is a characteristic of Korea as well. Basically, so non-regular workers are those who are on fixed-term contracts, whereas regular workers have the implicit lifetime employment situation. And they tend to be also part-time or dispatched workers sent off by like a manpower company, or atypical workers. So since 1986, the number of regular workers has stayed fairly constant around 35 million, whereas the number of non-regular has been rising from only about 6 million up to more than 20 million. So in the B panel, you can see that non-regular employment is concentrated among women. So more than 50% of women, female employees, are in non-regular status. This is compared to only about 23% of men. So it leads to a large gender wage gap and discourages some women who might want to be employed. It doesn't make it worth it for some people. So if we look at the key problem, the gap in income. So when you start off, people at the beginning of their careers, the wage difference between regular and non-regular is very small. But over time, the regular workers get their seniority-based wage increases, and they usually double or 2.5 times increase in their income, whereas non-regular workers stagnate. So we see a huge gap. And on top of this, many non-regular workers aren't covered by the pension system or the employee-based health care, and they don't get bonus payments. So they are treated less fairly in many ways. So if we look at, for women, the employment rate peaks around age 25 to 29, about 83% of women are employed. And if you look at what percentage are regular versus non-regular, about 2/3 start off as non-regular workers. But over time, you can see that the percentage of women who are regular workers falls dramatically towards zero by age 65. And so there's a huge share of women who are in non-regular status. So what it means is many of the women who were regular leave the labor force when they have children, and then when they come back as non-regular in a different status. So many women have an implicit choice of being single and pursuing this regular career. So on the left-hand side, panel A, single women, 80 to 70% start off as regular, and it stays about 70% till they reach their late 40s. And you can see the non-regular employment is much lower, the green line, at around 20% until they get older. For married women, you can see that the proportion not in the labor force, this brown line, is almost 70% among women in their 20s. Gradually that comes down, but the women who join the labor force are this green line coming in as non-regular workers. And the share of regular employment for married women stays roughly constant at about 20%. This chart was interesting as well. It's by Professor Kitao, who was at Todai. And basically it shows that for women who are non-regular, the higher education doesn't have much impact on earnings. So the solid green line is a woman who is non-regular but has a university degree. And you can see by the time they reach their 30s, their salary matches the green dotted line, which is non-regular female employees with a high school degree. So education doesn't really pay off for women if they don't become regular workers. Now, as a result of non-regular employment, women not having these long-term careers as regular workers, there are very few women who are in management. So the share of Japanese women who reach management positions is the lowest in the OECD, followed by Korea. This is hard to read, but it's on the listed companies, on the boards of listed companies. So Japan went from about 2% in 2013 to reach the 12% government target. And now the government has a target of 30%, which will be hard to reach. You can see that Japan is quite low on this measure as well. So this leads to a large gender wage gap. The wages of men, on average, is about 23% higher than for women. That's the fourth highest in OECD, reflecting non-regular status and the lack of management or high-level positions. The other problem that weighs on women is the non-paid work. So OECD, as I said, has statistics on everything, even how couples divide household labor. So non-paid work means basically cleaning the house, taking care of children, going shopping. So women in Japan would spend 3 hours and 41 minutes per day on this unpaid labor, and men about 40 minutes. So the gap is about 3 hours per day. So if a woman wants to be a regular worker with all the stress and implications of that, that's another obstacle. Whereas men in panel B are more likely to be involved in paid work. So how do we break down dualism? I always say this, I don't want to spend much time on this, but Prime Minister Abe, when he was Prime Minister in 2017, said the term non-regular work will be swept from this country. But it's very difficult to tell regular workers, it's very difficult to go to Randall, for example, and tell regular workers, you're going to lose your special status as regular workers. So first of all, we need to understand why do we have dualism. Well, when you ask companies, 39% say we need to reduce labor cost. These are mainly smaller companies because they get less pay and less social insurance premiums to pay. And then 33% say we need flexibility. So when the economy turns down, we want to reduce our staffing and adjust. And the fact that regular workers have an implicit lifetime contract, they are difficult to lay off. So if we look at this global competitive index, the lower third of Japan's in the lower third of OECD countries in terms of flexibility in both hiring and firing. We find that countries where it's flexibility in firing, we also have flexibility in hiring. So Japan actually has neither. The labor law is very vague on what constitutes a justifiable dismissal of a worker. So companies are afraid to do it because they don't know if the courts will come along and say, what you did was not legal, so you have to reinstate with back pay that regular worker. So the summary basically is it's extremely difficult for a company to know the validity of a dismissal, if it will stand or not stand. So I've argued for this strategy to try to break down dualism. We need to increase the coverage of social insurance for non-regular workers because they're not covered so well. And we have to improve training programs because companies don't really bother to train workers who are temporary. And we have to reduce employment protection for regular workers, as hard as that sounds. The basic idea is we shift our protection from protecting jobs to protecting workers. And this is a Nordic model of flexicurity, which also implies very high social spending, which is not always popular. The other question is phasing out social insurance and tax arrangements that discourage female employment. So we have a spousal tax deduction. So if the main earner, he gets a tax deduction, or she gets a tax deduction, if the second earner has an income below a certain threshold. And the threshold in 2018 was set at 1.55 million, about $10,000 US. And then we have exemption from social insurance. So if a spouse can earn less than 1.06, they are exempt from paying the pension and other social insurance. And if their spouse is not covered by employee insurance, they can earn up to 1.3. So these provisions discourage women from working, and also if they do work, it discourages how much they work. They don't want to go over these income thresholds. So this Professor Kitao did these simulations based on a huge database and found that if you got rid of the spousal deduction and the exemption from social insurance, that would encourage second earners, who are typically women, to join the labor force. So just to summarize her numbers, employment for 25 to 64 is 64.6%. If we got rid of the spousal deduction, it would raise female employment to 71.2. And by coincidence, if we got rid of the social insurance exemption, it would also go to 71.2. If we combine these two reforms, we could boost the female employment rate up to 77.1%, a 12.5% rise. So these provisions are popular, these tax exemptions, but they also are costly in terms of discouraging women from working or working less than they otherwise would. Let me turn now to the question of financial insecurity and how that influences the birth rate. So basically, I put marriage with it because in Japan, 98% of babies are born within marriage. So when young people say we can't afford to get married, that has a big impact on the fertility rate. And also, it's not only the financial insecurity. In many countries, almost all countries, other goals such as your careers and wealth and other objectives are more important. So it's not just the finance side. There's also cultural, but as an economist, I'm not qualified to talk about that very much. So we'll focus on this economic side of it. The government did a survey. This is IPS, a very respected institute in Tokyo. And they found that among young people 18 to 34, 80%, both men and women, these are single people, said they plan to get married eventually, and their desired number of children was 1.8 on average. And then they asked people, young people, what is the condition necessary for you to consider marriage? And 42% said being financially comfortable. Another 10% said finding appropriate housing. So the main block is finance for these people. Now, if we look at the labor market and marriage, the blue line shows regular workers. So by the time they reach the 30 to 34 age group, nearly 60% are married. But among non-regular workers, the increase is much smaller, only to about 22%. And if they are part-time workers, another category of non-regular, it's even lower, about 15%. So this labor market dualism is a factor disrupting young people getting married and having children. So in panel A, we have a chart showing the number of men who are married rising with income. So if we look at income of 1 to 2 million yen, the blue line for men 30 to 34, only 20% are married. But if you look at higher income, say 6 to 7, you get about 75% are married. So the income is the stumbling block again. On the right-hand side, we look at men in their 40s, up to income of 2 million yen, about half of people are married. But as you go up towards 50 million yen, you get up to about 95% of men are married. So this shows that the financial issues facing young people are a key stumbling block. And so based on all this, the fertility rate has fallen in Japan. It's been below 2 since 1975. If you look at the red line, it was 1.7 in 1980. It went down to 2004, and we had a small rebound. But then it's on a downward trend again, and we're down to 1.2 in 2023. If we look at other countries, of course, we're doing much better than Korea. We're down to 0.7, which is the lowest in the world, but we're well below the OECD at 1.6. So that's why Kishida said this is our top priority, to make a family or child-friendly society. I did a simulation based on the current parameters, what will happen to Japan's population. So we start off in 2022 at about 125 million people. If the birth rate stays at 1.3 and net immigration continues at 100,000 per year, and the employment rates by gender and age stay the same, then we would see the population fall from 125 million down to about 68, so about 46% by the end of the century. And employment would fall a bit more, from about 66 million down to about 31 million, about 51% decline. Well, this is a major challenge to address this type of demographic change. So what can we do to boost the fertility rate? When I used to visit Japanese ministers in government in the 1990s, they'd always say to me, yeah, we want more babies, but we want women to work. And if they work, they're not going to have babies. They thought there was this trade-off between fertility and employment. But we find over time that there's a positive relationship. Countries where fertility is higher tend to have higher female employment ratios. And this appears to be driven by the compatibility between women's careers and families. Without that compatibility, women choose to have fewer or no children. And so the question is, or the challenge, is to make it easier for parents, both men and women, to combine paid work and family so that people don't have to choose one or the other. So research by many people shows this depends on public social spending. How much does the government do that kind of eases or offsets the cost of having children? The role of fathers, are they present and active? Flexible labor markets, and that's something where Japan has a problem with this dualism. And also the social norms, whether mothers are supposed to be spending full time helping their kids get through school and into a good university. So looking at how Japan stands on this, the amount of spending on families has gone up because we've introduced early childhood care and education, but it's still relatively low, about 1.75% of GDP, compared to the OECD average is about 2.1. If we look at share of men taking parental leave, it's gone up from less than 1% up to over 10% in the past decade. One question, though, is how long is parental leave for fathers? So I saw the statistics that for men, more than half of them take less than 2 weeks. But that doesn't really change life a great deal, taking the 2 weeks. And of course, we know there's Shinjiro Koizumi, the son of the prime minister, got lots of press because his wife had a baby, and he said, I'm taking parental leave, and he took a total of 2 weeks over a 3-month span. So he took like an afternoon off every week. And so that doesn't really change the situation greatly either. Not to criticize Koizumi individually, but he was trying to set an example. Pardon?
You won't be a graduate. Yes.
Yes, he's very smart. I met him, he was in my mentor ministry for a long time. So I don't want to sound like I'm someone from Germany in the 1930s saying we all need more children. Basically, the idea is if you ask people how many children is the ideal number and how many is your intended number, this is IPS again, a very respected government research organization. People still want, ideal number is about 2.25, and their intended number is 2. So basically the challenge is trying to allow people to have their intended or even ideal number of children, so by removing obstacles. And you can talk about many different things in addition to childcare, education cost, and that's another long lecture as well. So let me turn now to the question of the elderly, how this is putting more burdens on the younger generation. So one of the reasons why we don't spend much on families is because the government spends a lot on older people. People over 65, their per capita medical expenditures are about 6 times higher than for people under 65. And so as the population ages, the government's spending more and more on the older generation, and that kind of squeezes out the younger. Nevertheless, we have a high rate of poverty among older people. The OECD, we never really look at absolute poverty because it's a very difficult concept to apply on a country-by-country basis, but this is relative poverty, the share of the population that has an income that's less than half of the median. So in Japan, that's about 20%. That's higher than the OECD average, is about 13.9. It's much better than Korea at 40%, but it's still relatively high. One reason is the pension system. So we look at pension replacement rates. How much do you receive in your pension relative to your income? So in Japan, by our measure, which includes full-time workers, we get a 32% replacement rate on a gross basis and only a bit higher, maybe 39% on a net basis. OECD average is 50% net and about 42% gross. So the pension payments are somewhat inadequate for people who retire. On top of that, private pension funds are small. You can look in OECD countries, the average is 100% of GDP is saved. This is kind of pillar 3 in retirement income, and Japan is only 30%. So we don't have a lot of private personal savings to offset the costs of retirement. The other problem is workers are forced out of their lifetime career at an early age. So about 93% of companies set a mandatory retirement age. Say at this age, everybody has to leave. And out of those 93%, about 80% set that age at 60, which is really not reasonable when the average life expectancy is 83 to 84. Basically saying retire at 60 and have 23 to 24 years to live on your savings and with a pension you might have. Now, the government made a law that you can have the right, and it's not a guaranteed right, in principle, you can have the right to continue working after age 60 if the company agrees. You can see that the number who shift to a non-regular among men, it goes from 10% for the 55 to 59 group up to over 70% by the time you're over 65. So you can stay and work, but you're going to be paid just a fraction of what you're making before. So many people might say, my opportunity cost of time isn't worth that, so they might leave. So we need to extend working lives as well. And if we did that, we would break down the seniority-based wage system, because that would break the link between seniority and pay. So Japan has a high elderly dependency ratio. We measure the number of elderly relative to people of working age, 20 to 64. So in Japan, in the red, it's already at 55% by 2023. So that means there are less than 2 people of working age for every retiree. And by the time we get to 2082, there'll be 85% ratio, which means 1.15 people of working age for every person over 65. So basically, young people face a prospect of, I'll be supporting me and one older person, which is somewhat discouraging. Of course, again, Korea, my other country I work on, is even a more difficult situation with the fertility rate of 0.7. So where is social spending going? In 1990 or 1991, social spending in Japan by the government was 10% of GDP, well below the OECD average. With aging, it shot up to 23%, and this was above the OECD average. Looking forward in panel B, we project, or the OECD projected, that social spending will rise by another 13% by 2060. So the blue line would be healthcare, green is pension, the gray would be long-term care and other spending, and so we would be going to 35%. And so we look at the OECD average, 20%. We see France at 31, the Scandinavian, the Nordic countries above 25. Japan might be the highest country in terms of social spending by the time we get to 2060. So let me just finish by talking about the fiscal situation, which has been a long-term time concern for the OECD and other people. So Japan has had a budget deficit every year since 1991, basically the year of the collapse of the bubble. And this looks at from the deficit from 2005 to 2022. In 2010, the Democratic Party government set a target of balance by 2020. We made some progress during the 20-teens as we doubled the VAT, the consumption tax, and we had faster growth with Abenomics. But then the pandemic hit, and we have another large deficit. We look at the deficit over those years. It's averaged 5.5% of GDP. OECD average is about 2.5% of GDP. So Japan stands out for this fiscal imbalance. So government debt is close to 240% of GDP, well above other OECD countries. I remember when Koizumi was prime minister, we had long conversations with the government, and we said, debt is 150%. This can't be sustained. We really have to do something. And now, 15, 18 years later, we're at 240%, and it's still on an upward trend. So what's helping Japan? Basically, with low interest rates, gross government interest payments are relatively low at 1.5% of GDP. That reflects monetary policy, because the Bank of Japan in 2016 introduced the yield curve control policy, which set the yield on 10-year bonds at 0, and they were sometimes negative. Now today, the 10-year bond yield, I think, is up to 1%, because we've achieved our inflation target, even surpassed it a bit. And so we no longer have that big advantage of extremely low interest rates. So how do we get out of this problem? We need to cut spending, but when you're aging as fast as Japan, it's going to be very hard to actually cut spending want to make sure we're efficient and everything, but it'd be very hard to cut. So we really have to look at revenue. And as economists, we always favor the VAT. The VAT is less harmful for economic growth. It is regressive, so you have to take offsetting measures. But Japan, it doubled it from 5 to 10, but the last prime minister, or 2 prime ministers ago, said it's not going any higher. But from our point of view, it needs to go higher towards the OECD average to try to finance both end the deficit and finance the new regime. So in terms of how Japan raises money, you can see only 20% is VAT or consumption tax. OECD is 1/3. Social Security contribution is very high, but we don't really want that to go higher. That's very regressive. The other thing is personal income tax. We only tax half of wage income in Japan for a variety of reasons, so we have to broaden the tax base. And finally, to quote Prime Minister Abe, we cannot have fiscal consolidation without economic revitalization. So Japan needs faster economic growth, and the key is labor productivity. Japan, despite having the highest education levels, having lots of R&D, lots of patents, the productivity per hour of labor input is about 28% below the top half of OECD countries. So trying to narrow that gap through faster productivity, and again, that's a whole another lecture. So basically, policy directions, I basically summarize them, trying to improve the financial position through the seniority-based wage system, the dualism. We have to address the problems that make it hard for families to combine children and dual income families. And then we have to try to help the elderly by eliminating mandatory retirement and also raising pension eligibility age, which is way too low, and then trying to address the fiscal problem. So let me stop there.
I'm going to start with one question, which is related to what you were saying about fertility rates. So fertility rates to me seem like something that people have very strong opinions about. When I was a kid, everyone worried about like a population bomb going off, that there were too many people being born. Today, we all sit around and wring our hands about not enough people being born. You know, when I think about this, right, globally, what drives fertility, right, was the introduction of 2 things, right? One was Social Security, so you no longer needed to rely on your children to support you in old age. You know, if you were 100 years ago in many, many countries, if you were a single person without financial assets, you would be in dire straits when you could no longer work. And that ended with Social Security and also the creation of capital markets. We've seen this pattern around the world, right? Practically every country in the world is now having fewer than 2 kids per person, per woman. And lots of countries have thought of lots of ideas to do this. Korea, I think, and most notably, I think spending a huge amount, was it 1 or 2% of GDP on trying to increase fertility rates, and it failed. So leaving aside the question of whether the optimal fertility rate for a woman is 2 or 1 or whatever, how confident are you that we actually know, like for, you know, people will say we should be doing more to support women to have more kids, but the policies don't seem to have big impact. They have small impacts. Right. But nobody, or to put it more forcefully, has any country in the world that's had fertility go below 2.1 gotten it above?
The only examples would be Eastern Europe, like Latvia, Lithuania, where during the communist era, people got depressed and they went down. And then when they became part of OECD and EU, then it went back up. But that's kind of a special case. And I agree, the financial incentives are very small. People talk about $300,000 to raise a child, and if you give somebody a subsidy of $1,000 a year, it's not going to offset it. Yeah. And so for me, the key factor really is this compatibility, because in principle, many young people want to have children. They want to have a regular career, an ambitious career. So to the extent that we can make that possible through family-friendly policies where there's easy to take parental leave, easy to take sabbaticals, all that, then it becomes possible to combine the two. I know President Yoon, when he introduced that program, he said, this probably isn't going to work, which isn't the right thing to say when you introduce a new policy. He said, in any case, it will make life better for what children we do have. And in Japan, it was about 1% of GDP that Kishida was talking about. He didn't say how to finance it, but he was talking about 1%. So for me, I think we should do these type of programs even to make things better for people who do have kids, and then by bringing in this better lifestyles, more family-friendly policies, and then we can let people who want to have kids not be stymied by the pressure that having a regular career in Japan would pose.
I want to just take one other question, then I'm going to open it up so everyone think of good questions. I want to just talk a little bit about the women issue in Japan, which I think, I agree with you completely, is one of the big, my big three issues for restoring Japanese growth. When I think about what's special about Japan, right, it's not that there's discrimination against women, right? So if you think back 60 years in the United States, if you had done what fraction of management was women, extremely low numbers. Japan would have looked very similar to the US, so it's not like, oh, Japanese have these views and Americans have different views. Right? What does look different is what happened over the next 60 years, right? Whereas the US saw a fairly substantial change in female labor force participation, but Japan also saw female labor force participation go up, but not at high levels, right? And I think in your charts, like US is at one side of that graph, and Japan's at the other side. In your mind, when we think about the success that the US has had in this, what is it that the US did that the Japanese didn't do?
Hard question. I think we have women going to university in much higher numbers in Japan now. It used to be a big gap between the male rate and the female rate. But when you look at what they study, there seems to be a social pressure that women might want to do education or healthcare, to be a nurse. So there seems to be some women-friendly career paths that take them one direction. That doesn't lead to management. And men tend to have another attracted to these STEM, for one thing, and also for other leadership type positions. So the share of STEM in Japan among women is the lowest, I think, in OECD. So I think women are really, they can get into even Todai. I think Yoko was saying only 20% of students are women. They can get into Todai, but they might not end up doing engineering or whatever. They end up doing more traditional female type jobs. So I think that stereotype exists, even though we've kind of torn down some of the barriers. There's still the stereotype that pushes people in certain directions. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to now open it up. I have plenty more questions, but I don't want to occupy all the time. Does anyone? Yes, over here. And just state your name and affiliation, even though I know who you are.
Hi, I'm Genki, visiting scholar at CJEB, and thank you for your talk, clear-cutting talk. And then I would like to ask you about the elderly poverty rate. I was a little bit surprised about it because while elderly people might get low income than the younger people, at the same time they pay pretty much lower expenditure about their life. For example, like a healthcare payment than the younger people. So how do you define the poverty rate, and then how do you think about it? Is it serious or not?
The poverty rate means you have an income that's below half of the national median. And so you're right, older people tend to have more assets, but some of the assets are in housing, and they're not very liquid, especially in Japan where you have ghost towns popping up even an hour west of Tokyo. It's hard to turn your house into money. So I think there is some thinking that it doesn't have to be as low as a working age population. But in most OECD countries, we have it down to 13% because of generous pension systems. So Japan doesn't have that, so we do have this wider gap. So it's not Korea, more than 40%, but I think it's something the government needs to address by the pension system. Longer working lives would raise replacement rates, and then we have to promote more private savings, and we have to continue to promote healthy aging and trying to reduce the increase in health spending over time and long-term care.
I see in the back. Oh.
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm Lean. I'm from Jordan, and I'm a second-year MBA student here at Columbia. My question to you is, given your experience at OECD and the research you've done over Japan, what are the most promising careers for youth in Japan over the next decade, in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. I would say being an entrepreneur. I mean, that's where Japan falls short. We have lots of very educated people, but the entrepreneurship in Japan is still at a relatively early age. And when I talk to my friends who have young children or college-age students, I asked them, how about being an entrepreneur? And to them, it sounds like unemployed, or it sounds like a feeder. A feeder is another term we use. And so they want their children to work either for a government ministry or a large corporation, and the idea of taking the risk of being an entrepreneur. So I think if we had more entrepreneurship in these smart young Japanese people, we could give them financing and more venture investment and not as much bank loans, which have collateral requirements and they bankrupt you if you can't pay it back. Trying to promote an entrepreneurial spirit by giving them the education, what it takes to be an entrepreneur, and then trying to ease the financing system so that there's more business angels who will invest in that area.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the lectures. My name is Satoshi Miura from Jetro, New York. So my question is about the proportion of old people in entire population and its burden on young people. So I'm curious about your view on how we set the retirement age. In other words, where the pension is begun to be paid. There's history that it used to be like 55 or so long time ago, and it went up to 60, and today it's 65 is the default. So many people are employed until the age 65, and would it be a reasonable logic to extend that to further into 70 or 75? Do you think it's reasonable? And referring to maybe the experience of the other OECD countries, how is your view?
I think setting it at 65 for everyone. Right now it's different for men and women and that. But get a 65 rate for everyone, and then go to a system where the pension payment is conditional on the population, the number of old people, life expectancy. So it's kind of set endogenously by the system. And then over time, try to raise it further. There's a book called The 100-Year Life that was written a while back. I think they were at LSE. And basically, the Japanese government, Motegi used to always cite this, that out of kids born in 2018 in Japan, half will live to the age of 108. And so if you lived 108, you really shouldn't retire until you're 90. It's kind of intimidating for some people. So I think we have to make more second careers for people. If you make it 65 in one career, what can you do for another 15, 20 years if you have a life expectancy of 100? And try to extend the working life in that way. So I think making the pension system react to the increase in life expectancy and then increasing these second career jobs will help people with the aging problem.
In the back?
Hi, thank you. I'm Vincent. I'm a second-year MBA student. And can you share, like, what's your thought on change of immigration, like, regarding like the topics you share, such as population decline and labor shortage in Japan?
I think there's a big shift going on in Japan in terms of immigration. In the past, people were not very positive in polls. Now you ask people, do we need more foreigners in Japan to work? And you get about 70% say, yes, we need more foreigners in Japan. If you said, do we need more immigration, you might not get the same response. But then they had this system called the Technical Internship Training Program, which was not very popular for many people because foreigners would come in and they would have 3 to 5 years and they gave their passport to an employer. And there was a lot of mistreatment. They weren't treated very well. And now we have these specialized SSW, specialized sector workers in 14 categories. And they can come in for 5 years, and there's a path. It's limited, but there's a path to permanent residency. So I think there's a realization that Japan actually really needs these workers. In the past, I visit like an old folks' home, and they say, we don't need foreign workers. We have robots. Robots will be able to take care of us in the future. I think robots can build cars. I don't think they can care for an elderly person. So I think we really need the immigration. And we see certain countries, Nepal, for example. I'm amazed at how many people, when I go to Japan, are from Nepal. They seem to have an affinity for Japan. So I think that there's a real change in the mentality. People realize how much we need immigration. And the competition is going to get fiercer and fiercer. As David mentioned, more and more countries are below 2. I did a survey in Malaysia as an OECD consultant. They're down to 1.8, and they're still a middle-income country. And so you have Korea shortages, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China's going to face shortage. So we're all going to be competing for these workers. And so if you can get them now, get them in, give them a permanent visa and let them become part of Japan, I think everyone sees that as really kind of the solution for the future.
Over here in the back.
Hi, this is Kunal from first year CBS MBA. My question is that a lot of the numbers you mentioned are similar for Japan and Korea. So if Korea is also facing the same issues where they have even lower fertility rates, so what would be your recommendations for Korea if they were also to get out of the same situation?
It's even more intense, the idea that you have to meet family-friendly workplaces, because in Korea, the work culture is even more severe. Maybe Japan 30 or 40 years ago, where people don't get home before midnight. It's really not possible to have two regular workers in one household. So Japan needs this family-friendly parental leave. They need to change their culture. And it's a very difficult situation. The one advantage for Korea is they're a low-debt country. Low debt, 50%. But they're where Japan was in 1990. And so my fear is that if they do the same thing, we're going to end up with the fiscal situation Japan has. But so far, Korea has a big hatred of taxes. They can't raise their VAT. And so they're going to have a choice between either financing the older people or raising taxes. And so far, they're just putting off the decision.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Dan. I'm a freshman at St. Lawrence University. My question is about the policies of increasing regular workers in rural area. Because I'm from Hiroshima, and then whenever I go back, my grandparents will tell me the economy is shrinking. So I understand in Tokyo, like there's a policy to increase regular worker for female, but what about in rural area? What are the policies that could increase the regular worker for female?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. I know for an economist, they always talk about having regional balance, and what is the advantage of that? Why do we focus on where people live? Basically, I just see a consolidation going forward. I see Tokyo and Osaka getting bigger. And I've been to Yubari, for example, in Hokkaido, 120,000 people down to 9 over the space of 30, 40 years. And so I think we're going to see more and more consolidation. And for old people, actually cities are better because you spend a lot of your time going to medical appointments. And if you're in Tokyo, your doctor's not far away. In the countryside, it's very difficult. So I think it's kind of inevitable. We're going to see more and more consolidation over time where people live. Not a very good answer. I'm sorry for Hiroshima.
I think we have time for one last question. So over here.
Hello, I'm Alyssa Park. I'm from Columbia undergraduate studying business management concentration. As I am from undergraduate school, I've been seeing, I'm a Korean student. In comparison to like Chinese and Korean international students, like the population of Japanese international students is very, very low. And I think the common things that I hear from like a few Japanese friends that I have is that Japan is like known for like not letting their young emerging students go outside of their country to study internationally abroad, in comparison to China and Korea. So I was wondering if you think that has anything to do with like the working system in Japan, because you mentioned about Todai, and even there, the female percentage in terms of population is lower. So yeah.
Well, I teach at SAIS, and my classes are full of Chinese and some Koreans. I haven't had a Japanese student yet. I'm very, very sad. I love Korean and Chinese as well, but I'd like to have some Japanese students. I think the explanation I hear from my friends is Japan is such a wonderful place to live. Why leave if you don't have to? And in Korea, it's very hard for young people to get good jobs. Young Koreans don't want to work for an SME. They want to work for Samsung or the government, and it creates pressure to keep your studies going as long as possible. If you're 25 and you have a master's, you can't get that golden ticket to the chaebol or to the government. Just got to get another degree somewhere and just keep trying. Whereas in Japan, labor shortages, the job offer applicant ratio is always closer to 2. And so everybody can get a job in Japan, and going overseas can be expensive and doesn't necessarily really pay off. So I think Korea is in a different situation where young people, there's still lots of them, and they can't get the jobs they want. So going overseas is a natural way to try to make yourself different. So I think Korea will be like Japan before long as well.
So I'm sorry I've got to bring this to a close. I want to just thank you for a great presentation. I also just want to invite all the audience to check our website about upcoming events and activities and follow us on social media. And thank you again to our corporate and individual sponsors. I look forward to seeing you at future events.